we're on the air. Today I'm with S-Man Speaks for our second debate, and we're going to be discussing capital punishment and whether or not it's valuable or a good thing. So S-Man, take it away.
Alrighty. Capital punishment has been quite frequently used for a very long time, and the debate talking about capital punishment and whether it's a good thing or not isn't really new in the world, and I'm on the side that says capital punishment is a good thing. There's really no reason to keep people who've committed such heinous, vile, disgusting crimes alive in this world. In your video about capital punishment, the one thing I could agree on is where it'd be bad when it comes to things that aren't even crimes, for example, like in the Middle East, where they execute people for homosexuality and other things, and I would agree that yeah, it's not a good system to have. As for in the United States, when you're talking about President Trump and how you didn't think capital punishment was good because under his power, the Eighth Amendment does prohibit cruel and unusual punishment. I actually forgot to point out in my response to that, where you said that and I wasn't sure why you brought up President Trump when it came to capital punishment, and we were pointing out how there were some things where people were executed for crimes that aren't even like murder. In Kennedy versus Louisiana, it was determined to be illegal to execute someone for a crime that is anything other than murder. And at the end of the day, to execute these people is just to get them out of everyone's head. It's to just completely get rid of them, and there is no purpose to keep them alive in the first place. It would be very hypocritical for a condemned inmate to argue that their life matters and we should be giving them mercy when they didn't show any to their victim to begin with. And I could very easily bring up a number of cases, in the United States at least, of brutal crimes that some people called for the death penalty. And in my opinion, even though it is illegal to mandate death sentences, it'd be nice if that were the case. However, if a family were to say that I don't want my relative executed, I don't want this person executed in my relative's name, then I would like that and go with a lesser punishment of like life without parole or something.
Interesting point. A lot of stuff said there, and a lot of things I have to say in response. But just initially, you mentioned that the Middle East is an example of where capital punishment is not a good method to use because of the backwards and often clearly morally defunct laws they have in place there. So, for instance, homosexuality is punishable by death in some of those countries, and obviously that's something that people with modern views consider is wrong. However, in the US, we still see lots of lawmakers, as you mentioned just now with Trump, not really having morals that are good. There are many people in the US who would happily make homosexuality against the law again, and many other things. For instance, the possession of drugs is still illegal in many states, and we see drug dealers and people in possession of marijuana punished quite severely. As a consequence, can you think that handing the death penalty as a punishment whilst we have these administrations is a justifiable thing, when at any one point the person in charge of your nation may have questionable morals? If you're basing it to say, oh, well, we don't have the death penalty here because we have questionable morals, but then it's okay if we don't, when government is a constantly changing and evolving apparatus, and as we're seeing, Trump has the ability to possess characters who have very questionable morals, is it justifiable to allow the death penalty to be given when those who administer it are potentially corrupted in the mind, as you've already said in this debate?
Quite frankly, yes, it's still appropriate to have the death penalty, and the reason why I say that is if any of them in my country were to take their questionable views, and I absolutely do agree that my commander-in-chief does have some very questionable views, that if he and any of his anyone in his administration were to try to make certain things punishable by death, that the Supreme Court would probably step in and stop it. For example, when it comes to drug dealers and people who possess drugs, I believe that is a crime against the state, and I think that you'd have to have a huge amount of drugs to qualify for the death penalty. And I think that with some recent news of several states penalties were thrown out, violating the Eighth Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court would stop the Trump administration if they were trying to make certain things punishable by death, and for those who were wanting to make homosexuality illegal, it was made legal in 2015, and they could try all they want, but it's probably something they couldn't reverse. Morals, which is something else I kind of noticed you pointed out in your video on capital punishment. Morals are quite frankly subjective. Some people might say it's morally wrong for me to be an atheist. And I think you said you were one as well. That it would be morally wrong for us to be atheists, or it's, according to vegans like Vegan Gains, it's morally wrong to eat meat. It's morally wrong to contribute, in his words, to the suffering and death of animals. But it's to eat meat. It's actually quite frankly a social norm to be an atheist, at least in my country, and it's still quite a social norm for people to say to be in favor of capital punishment. That's kind of dwindling in my country, but quite frankly, at the end of the day, there's still pretty much no reason to keep people like murderers alive. And if I were to be in charge, I'd quite frankly make depending on how bad it is, I wouldn't. If you commit indecent exposure, I'm not going to have you executed. If you exploited a child or hurt pretty much anyone, and it's a sex crime, I'd put it up to I make it a capital offense. But under Louisiana, that's illegal to do.
More interesting points. Just quickly though, if morals are subjective, then how do you morally decide who gets to live and die?
Quite based on what they do is illegal, but then people argue it's morally wrong for the state to execute inmates. But then why should the inmate complain when he or executed for the crimes they've committed? And as for the state deciding, I think it's actually quite fair. And if anything, the inmates should be kind of thankful that the state will actually be the ones to do it, because there's been instances where death row inmates who were just on death row have either been murdered by other inmates or things like that. And quite frankly, some of those deaths have been quite brutal, and the states that still carry out executions must abide by the Eighth Amendment, or anything they try to do to execute the inmate, and their death row conditions have to abide by the Eighth Amendment, or it's declared unconstitutional. And several states have had their death penalty statutes declared unconstitutional, so a lot of them have been trying to abide by the Eighth Amendment.
Again, though, when you say the state is doing the right thing and it's justified, is it not coming down to their own morals being determinants of law? So when you say morals are subjective, they are, but how do you then decide who gets to live and die? You are surely using your morals to determine this, and thus being subjective in yourself. You can answer this, and I'll come on to a load of other things you said, because I've written down a fair amount. But you go ahead and answer that.
As to how we can use subjective morals to determine, I base it on severity.
But that's morale, not morals. Again, that's subjective again, because how do you know severity is subjective just as much as morals is? So surely it's also subjective to say that, the severeness of this kind means you will die. That's subjective.
That's true, and quite frankly, there's been, and at one point, I'd actually have to say that I wouldn't mind abolishing capital punishment on if there should be a few conditions to be made. However, if it's morally wrong to kill, or in better words, to execute the condemned, but I'd have to ask a question of what purpose do they serve? We just have them sit in a prison cell for, I believe, 23 hours a day. They have no purpose being here for if it's morally right or wrong. I know that it's been argued in your comment section, someone said, "What if it was one of your loved ones?" And you did say you'd be incensed. I'd quite frankly leave it up to the family if they want that person to die. There's been cases where people have said that they don't want someone killed executed in the name of their loved one, and they think that or in cases where they said, "Hey, maybe they might give us some information if we drop the death penalty."
Well, I think you set a very dangerous precedent if you allow the families of the victims to determine the laws. Coming on to some other things you said just now, whether a person should be, you say, sitting in prison, rotting away. Yeah, obviously that is a case of them doing nothing, but doing nothing is a punishment and a way of moving someone like that out of society without murdering them. But through the death penalty. And you yourself have said that morals are subjective. So again, the family's morals as to whether someone should live or die would change per person. So basing your system on the morals that you've suggested is surely not reliable. But to come on to something else you said about the state, is the state a legitimate factor in allowing someone the right to die, in murdering someone?
In the state, could you elaborate a bit further?
So, does the government have the power to murder their citizens?
In the case of capital punishment, I believe yes. And I will agree that no, it's not a deterrent. Like, that was another thing I agreed with, is it's not a deterrent. And unfortunately, it's not a deterrent, but with some people, it might scare them into pleading down to a lighter sentence. It might convince... and it might get them to give evidence to avoid. But I do believe that death row inmates can propose a potential harm to other inmates who are serving lesser sentences or lighter sentences, and to guards. And if in the United States, at least there's 2,000 people awaiting execution, 7 or so are in California, and if we were to abolish capital, if we were to execute them all, or at the very least those who've exhausted their appeals, disregard the execute them all remark, if we were to execute those that have exhausted their appeals, and then I would believe instead of having the taxpayers pay for housing death row inmates, force the inmates to do labor around the prison to pay for their own appeals, abolish and enforce inmates to share a cell with other people, and do that whether you have capital punishment or not, to save money. And I would believe that would probably be a way to have a country function with capital punishment. I wouldn't have a problem with abolishing it under a few conditions, that it would not be retroactive, and quite frankly, in my opinion, I find the specific methods of how they do it to be firing squad is a better way than lethal injection. If I were to be asked about that, and when it comes to people thinking that. And to be honest with you, the death penalty isn't being used very often in the United States today. You probably have a better chance of dying of natural causes, suicide, or some other way than being executed. 20 years ago, they executed nearly 100 people in this country, and I think they've barely executed 10 or 15. I can't remember how much this year, but a lot of states haven't executed people in about 5 or 10 years.
Well, a lot of points again. You tend to cover a lot. Where to start? Firstly, the deterrent thing. You are right in saying it's not a deterrent. In fact, it's actually worse, because in states where capital punishment is legal, there's more violence, there's more crime, and there's more violent rhetoric and language, violent themes, attitudes in the people who live and reside in those states. So, if anything, capital punishment causes a more hostile and crime problematic system. We can go on to a lot of things you said were pretty questionable. So, for instance, you talk about people wasting money on people being left on death row. And in fact, capital punishment itself the system that puts them on death row costs more than just having them in normal prisons. And we can see this in the way prisons that use capital punishment mount up massive taxpayer fund costs. So it's literally a case of these people being put to death is wasting the state's money. You said that people run up their appeals, but the entire appeal process and, in fact, incarceration as a whole has massive racial and economic problems. So, for instance, 44% of people on death row are black, despite that being, I think, 12% of the country's population. And that obviously shows a bit of a racial inequality within the system and the problem with the crime as a whole. But if you are black, you are far more likely, I think 7 times more likely to be sentenced. And we have, what we can see, problems with the judicial system. But additionally, economically, because black people are poorer than white people on average and thus can't afford decent lawyers and to be represented properly, they can't represent themselves well, especially once they're on appeal and they're having to appeal their death row, which in itself is unlikely to be overturned if you're using public lawyers compared to like the state or the family of someone who can afford much better lawyers. So people who end up on death row have extremely low chances of fairly getting an appeal. And again, to come back to something you said earlier, I suppose you'd say a fair amount. It comes on to the idea that you said yourself, homosexuality was only made nationwide legally in the US in 2015. That's 2 years ago, less than 2 years. So given how long it's taken for a country as culturally important as the US to actually make something clearly fine legal, is it reliable to use this metric and this system to execute people? And again, the US has a horrendous track record of executing people who weren't provably guilty and weren't committing crimes like that bad. Notably, Stanley Tukey Williams is one example of someone who reformed himself under prison and was doing a tremendous job performing and helping young people who were involved in gangs and helping people in prison sort of change their ways and end up leaving prison a better person. And the state executed him despite his clear change of mindset. Given there are people like Tukey being killed by the state, is it justifiable to have the death penalty when there's so many problems with it and it's clearly making mistakes? Innocent people are dying. Like, for all you talk about, the families will be fixed. Look at the innocent lives that have been lost to capital punishment.
I didn't say the families would be fixed. I personally, if the family were to say they didn't want the death penalty on the table, then if the prosecutors wanted to, they could just drop the death penalty. When it comes to when you said that their appeals would be more, it would be very hard to overturn them. A lot of people have sued, and a lot of people have had their death sentences overturned when it comes to inmates on the grounds that it was racially motivated in seeking the death penalty. And when it comes to capital punishment in the United States, again, the rates of execution have been dropping because more states have been trying to abide by the 8th Amendment. And quite frankly, yes, I do believe that Stanley Tukey Williams, well, his nickname's Tukey, did he try to make he did make changes to try and make himself a better person. There have been claims, I believe, where they said that, I'm trying to find that where it is. But when it actually, there were some claims, I'm not exactly sure how true they were, where it was claimed that he was still maybe being involved in some activity, but I honestly doubt I doubt that's even the case. But
I doubt that too.
Yeah, I looked at it, and I don't even trust Wikipedia. The only way I can is if it shows external sources that could be checked out. But when it comes to, you mentioned racial inequality, or at the very least racial issues that blacks make up. You said 13% of my country's population. That they are the 44% of death row, I think, or at least prison. And I'd have to ask, people in this country of why that is. That 13% don't they commit more crimes? And not trying to make any unfair generalizations, but still, when you really have to ask those whether or not it's okay that 13% of the population, some reason, makes up 44% of the population. Yet, when it comes to death row appeals and how it's supposedly a lot harder to overturn, to point out, there's been a number of cases where people have had their death row, their death sentences overturned on the grounds that it was unfairly tried, or misconduct, or bias, or whatever the case may be.
But that still doesn't justify the death penalty. Like, even ignoring the factors which cause the higher number of black inmates in prisons, like, that doesn't justify executing them. And I think it's incredibly dangerous and unfair to say, oh, well, we don't know for sure whether our system is working, but we're still going to execute people we've put on death row, even though there are clear flaws in our system. And economically, at the very least, we can see that giving people, win this appeal, otherwise you will be sentenced to death, is an extremely morally and lawfully corrupt and bankrupt way of managing your prison populations. Executing people on the basis of whether they won an appeal in courts which have clear problems with racial equality, as the countless cases of racially motivated sentencing has been inducted, shows that we can't afford to have anyone innocent dying. And I think that while we have, even if capital punishment was, even if I agreed with capital punishment, which I don't, but even if I did, whilst we have a system which can sentence at least one person to death without justifying it, without them being innocent, we can't have that system. You talk of, it might, other families will be happy if they want the person to die as a response to their own family member being affected. But look at the families of those, the innocent who have been sentenced. They clearly haven't benefited of it. They did nothing wrong. And even more so, look at the families of actual criminals. So for all you can say, oh, this murderer deserves to die, this person deserves to die for their crime, what about the family who lose a family member as a result? They've done nothing wrong. Their lives haven't been... they're an innocent party in this, yet they are going to lose a family member and thus have the trauma and stress of that happening to them. We forget that when you kill someone, there's more effects than just, oh, that person is dead, they are happy. And I think you'll find that a family that says, oh, we want this person dead, otherwise we can't live well, that's not something which is going to really fix anything. It's, oh, that person's dead, but they're not going to, none of their grief's going to go away. None of their actual happiness is going to be attained. And if anything, given that there's no deterrent to capital punishment for this, and there's no real feeling of satisfaction or payment back, it can be argued it actually creates a worse feeling to the family. And so I don't think it's a good methodology to base this on. I don't think you can base capital punishment on these things.
It doesn't pay anything back. Well, what does keeping them alive even pay back? Some people do consider that the inmate dying is payback and retribution. I would agree necessarily expensive, and part of me would actually agree that it wouldn't be a bad idea to abolish capital punishment because of how expensive it's gotten. The overzealous use of the death penalty should only be used in crimes of and there are special circumstances for which inmates where their crimes might land them on death row. And honestly, when it comes to again, quite a few states have actually have abolished it, so we might be reducing the death row population. As for whether or not it's about the perpetrator's family's pain, quite frankly, some might find it okay and might not care as much as for what the victim's family went through. At the very least, I will agree that it's probably a bit well, actually, I wouldn't say unfair. I'd agree that, yeah, they didn't do anything wrong, but quite frankly, the state doesn't have to care, and the state doesn't have to can you can petition the state to halt the execution or to do whatever if they don't want the execution to go forward. But at the end of the day, the state has the final call as to whether or not the person lives or dies.
Well, again, you yourself said about subjectivity. How do you determine what a special circumstance is? How do you allow the state this power to execute its citizens when it changes state per state as well? You say, lots of states are abolishing the death penalty, but lots more aren't. And certainly, whilst we have a government like one you do at the moment, is it justifiable to allow this power to them and to the state at all, while the potential for these people to be in power is in case? Because, yeah, we have our moral standards now, but it's clear that many people in America and across the world don't hold these same values. So it's dangerous to allow a system that executes people on the basis of one person's morals that can change over time. And especially in a system where economy will affect your sentencing and your incarceration. I think it's extremely dangerous to allow wealth to be a factor in sentencing, which it sadly is, because if you're wealthy, you can afford better lawyers. Hence why people who are black or more likely to be poor have a worse chance of faring well in court because they have lawyers which are doing voluntary work rather than a lawyer who is paid and thus has financial incentives to represent their client well.
When it comes to that, ineffective counsel is also a circumstance of where death sentences have been overturned on the grounds of ineffective counsel. And when it came to the point of where you said what circumstances, I'm just going to go with my state, for example, the state of Utah. Each state might have similar or different circumstances. The murder was committed, I'm going to read this verbatim. The murder was committed incident to a hijacking. The defendant knowingly created a grave risk of death for one or more persons in addition to the victim of the offense. The defendant committed or attempted to commit more than one murder at the same time, and the list does go on. The one circumstance I would probably have to say is a bit vague is the one where it says the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, cruel, or depraved, or involved torture. When it comes to cruel or depraved or atrocious, that'd be a bit vague as to what we would consider. Where would the line be between where we would call it atrocious, cruel, or depraved? But we don't just execute, like when it comes to the death penalty in the United States, we don't just execute people for, if you walk down the street and you shot someone, you wouldn't you wouldn't be sentenced. They wouldn't just sentence you to death. There'd have to be special circumstances like underlying offenses like kidnapping, robbery, burglary, rape, whatever the case may be. And quite frankly, some states have been actually have been slowing down executions and been making sure the appeals process has been more fleshed out than it used to be. In fact, in some states, when they reinstated the death penalty, some people could be executed under 10 years, and now they're taking a little longer to flesh out and see if it's a good idea to execute them. And in some cases, I would agree that maybe it was a bit unfair to execute some of the inmates, considering the fact that some of them did make changes, like Carla Faye Tucker,
But again, it comes back to, you say, there have been incidences of capital punishment sentences being overturned, but have is not always, and it's not. It only needs one unjust death to question the entire system, let alone the over 100 which have taken place, which have been unjust or dubious. You mentioned heinous, cruel, or atrocious crime, murders, but again, in a system where not only have the police been shown to fabricate and extend the reality of what actually goes on in cases, but these words are again subjective. Who is to decide what is a heinous crime? How much of a murder do you need to commit before it becomes a depraved murder? Like, these concepts are so interchangeable and so subjective, I guess is a key word really, that allowing someone to be sentenced to death on this is ridiculous. And again, especially when you can go back to the police for a second, when there are noted cases of the police not only being represented by their firms, so having more money than the accused, but being able to influence the biases of judges. And yeah, obviously it's not all judges, but certainly there are still hundreds of law judges where racial biases and police favoritism has come into play, and thus sentencing people on the basis of the fact that they've had their crime, or crime in quotation marks, overplayed. And thus having a death sentence in a system like this is unforgivable. And even in a completely working system, it's not justifiable to execute your citizens regardless of the crime. To kill another life is not acceptable.
And usually I don't buy the whole where the state just uses morals, like they've set in stone special circumstances where if a crime does not fall within those special circumstances, that the sentence of death won't be imposed. And we do have juries in the United States where they'll determine the aggravating factors, and by law it has to be unanimous to determine whether or not someone can be executed for a crime. And there's other special circumstances, like if it's a police officer, or if it was a hate-motivated crime where someone dies, then if it's like crime, then the death penalty might be considered. And when it comes to if the inmates, if some of them might be unable to afford decent counsel, counsel in general, well, we do have pro bono lawyers that do it for free, and an appeals process that does take a lot longer than it needs to be. And I think that's all. I think that's pretty much what you did say, but go ahead.
I mean, pro bono lawyers, yeah, obviously they are people who can represent you for free, but it's quite clear, certainly in a capitalist society, to use my favourite word, under this society where wealth buys you better quality, it's not exactly a reliable factor using state law, voluntary and pro bono lawyers, using these services against someone who can afford the elite of lawyerdom and who can afford better quality isn't likely to benefit you in the long run. And again, even with this in case, there are still racial prejudices in the system that allow for problems to develop, hence why there's such a problem with racial split of the makeup of prisons. And I think I'll ask a direct question. What would you actually say is a crime punishable by death? What would you say someone has to do to warrant the state executing them?
It would have to involve
just quickly, and overstepping their own right to life as a human being. What is a big enough crime to eradicate the need for a life?
Okay, I'll answer that question right here. It would have to involve an underlying crime, like if the murder was committed in the course of an act of terrorism, or if the murder were to be committed in the course of like burglary, robbery, rape, kidnapping, arson, or any offense like that. I would say that would be warrant. Or if the victim was a police officer, prosecutor, or just some type of lawyer, or if it was a hate crime, for example, like if someone were to kill you for being black, or to kill someone for being gay or transgender, where I would say that would warrant the death penalty. Or if multiple people were killed, like there were more than one murder, at the very least 2 or 3. But if it was just, and the reason I think some laws are probably complicated when it comes to what is determined to be death eligible for some crimes, is probably to avoid people being able to avoid having to get a lot of loopholes in the system. And if we were to abolish capital punishment, at the very least not make it retroactive. And to be honest with you, I knew at some point I was going to hear the word capitalism. I just knew it. I had a gut feeling.
Into everything, yes, man. Your list of crimes for which you should sentence someone to death for is very lenient, I have to say. Burglary is punishable by death.
I'm sorry? I didn't catch that last part.
burglary is punishable by death.
Well, no, I'm like murder in the course of like a burglary. Like if someone breaks in your home and you're there and they kill you.
So if I see. So murder in the case of all the things you listed. Okay. Do you think an eye for an eye is a good law to or good moral to judge your laws on, as you've just done here?
Yes, and another thing I forgot to address was when it comes to people and how the victim is treated, like taking away someone's right to live in quotation. Well, they did take the right of their victim away to live. So who would the inmate be to argue that their life should be treated with the same empathy or in the same regard as their victim when they didn't show that to their victim to begin with?
Well, again, though, whilst obviously they have impeded on someone else's rights, but does that justify the state impeding on their own rights? Does this state have the power to? Why?
Because they didn't show it to their victim in the first place. So therefore, why should we have to show the same human decency that they denied their victim? It'd be very hypocritical for the inmate to go in there and argue that their life matters when they didn't show that to their victim to begin with, or victims, you know.
Why should the state, though, enact the same murder they did on another person on them? What's the point, really? State, as a moral conscience even, should be able to punish the person without murdering them and killing them. And again, every human has the right to life, and the fact that one human was impeded shouldn't mean that we then take it away from someone else. I don't see the logic in doing that, because who does it satisfy? If they're going to prison, then they've been taken out of society anyway.
To answer who would that satisfy? Well, it might satisfy the victim's family and the public, and quite frankly, death row inmates do present a risk to other inmates who they're not among the condemned, and they might present a risk to guards. And quite frankly, some people, for example, Scott Peterson in California, he has pretty much like a 5-star cell. Actually, on death row. If you did you hear the case, by the way? I don't think you have. I'm not sure.
I'm not aware of the Scott Peterson case. Doesn't ring a bell.
Okay. Well, he was convicted in 2005, I believe, for the murder of his wife, first-degree murder of his wife, second-degree murder in the death of his unborn child. And to me, if you kill someone who, like an unborn child, she was 8 months pregnant, by the way. Their bodies were found, I think, probably around the December. But as I was reading upon that actually started to put me in favor of capital punishment. Is when people take that child didn't even have never had a chance to live in this world, and his father killed him and his mother. And I know I sound like I'm arguing. I don't know why it just sounds like I'm arguing against abortion, which my views are actually starting to change a bit on abortion. But to get back to capital punishment, when it comes to those who've taken like a baby's life, like for example, if the mom's like about a month away from having a kid, quite frankly, the dad didn't give the kid a chance to live. Why should he be allowed to live among those? And besides, it might bring some peace. I wouldn't say closure, because there's no such thing as closure when it comes to when you've lost a loved one. There's always going to be a hole there, but you might get some peace knowing that someone who's done something so deplorable isn't going to be alive among you on your tax dollar for the rest of their natural existence, who's just going to sit there and live among the society. Sure, they're removed from society, but they're still alive, and some people might find peace with that person not being here.
Well, firstly, who is truly going to find peace when a person being murdered, really? Like, deep down, that doesn't satisfy people. But secondly, you said the crimes of Scott Peterson, and yeah, he's an awful person, and there's no questioning that he is horrible. However, you said, and I quote, "That put me more in favour of capital punishment." So does that not suggest that your emotions have started to come into your argument when you're coming into it, and thus you have perhaps lost a little bit of, I don't want to be rude here, you have lost a little bit of logic when you're making this point, because you're saying, this person's awful actions make me more in favour of this, whereas that shouldn't impede, as terrible as his actions were, that shouldn't impede his right to life. As the moral arbiter and conscience for the state gives itself, it shouldn't be using its morals to subvert its own laws and murder one of its own citizens. And yeah, it's true that Scott Peterson was I don't know if he's
he's alive.
He's okay. He's alive. Okay, so he is a terrible person. But for every Scott Peterson, there are plenty more who haven't done anything near as this, but will still have the same consequence of death. Who still who have essentially being put into the same category as the rest to be demonized. And yeah, you can say, oh well, we can make amendments, not make this happen. We can try and reform the system, but while you have the system of death, the death penalty, you still risk and still allow for these people to be you allow for these people to be put into the condemned death sentence. We haven't even spoken about the mentally ill and how they are essentially treated terribly by the legal system and in prison, leading to them being unable to fairly represent themselves and thus being put to death. And we haven't discussed the terrible nature of the death, the actually execution themselves. Like, plenty of execution methods are unreliable, costly, painful, akin to torture in some cases when it goes wrong, as it often can do. Is that justifiable? Is torture act against the Human Rights Convention acceptable for a state to enact?
To address where you said that I let my emotions, when I was reading on the case, I, at the time, a few years ago, as I was reading up on this, I didn't let emotions play into it. I just said, who is let's just call it for what it is, a baby killer and a wife killer. And to address another point of that having them just sit in prison is a punishment. For some, it's not a punishment. Some people might actually be quite happy on the inside, and quite frankly, having them alive, there's no point in having them alive. Life in prison for some may be a punishment, but for others, it's probably not. As for the mentally ill, I would agree. It's not a good idea to execute them. And there have been cases where death execution the person's mental state isn't sound, and in fact, about a decade ago, over a decade ago, they made it illegal under the 8th Amendment to execute those that are mentally handicapped. I believe that you have to have an IQ above 70 or 72 to be eligible for execution. As for the Scott Peterson case, for the largest death row populations in California, they haven't executed people in 10 years. So if you're sentenced to death in California, you pretty much have nothing to worry about. And as for reforming, I believe it's possible. It would probably be very complicated, and the only reason I would ever abolish capital punishment is on the circumstance that it would not be retroactive, but it would be outlawed as of a certain date.
Again, so you said, people go into prison are happy on the inside. That's subjective. Some people will die and be happy with their death. Some people will want to be made a martyr, or they'll see themselves as a martyr because they've died for their crimes. Yeah, obviously that's not the case for everyone, but basing laws around subjective things is somewhat, especially in the case of death, is somewhat dangerous, I feel. IQ, again, as well, IQ is such a, it's not a fixed thing, is it? It's not really provable. So again, the mentally ill can still be disadvantaged by that, and even with these laws, still are misrepresented, and still can be negatively treated by the death penalty. A very famous example in the UK was of the last person to be executed in the UK was a mentally ill man who didn't understand what was going on in the cases of his crime, and whilst he was sentenced to death for murder, really, the more you look at it, it becomes clear it was more of manslaughter than murder. That person was sentenced to death, and consequently, the death penalty has been abolished in the UK. Comparatively, in the US, lots of people who are mentally ill face a higher risk of being executed than the rest because they don't have the means to adequately defend themselves. And you say, oh, in California, they don't execute people really. And if you're on death row, it's unlikely you will actually be executed. Is that not a colossal waste of money to have people that are persistently on death row? It could just be like normal inmates waiting for a death sentence that might never come. What's the point of even having the system if it's not even going to do what it's there to do? And again, you say, oh, reform is possible. Not only would it take a serious assessment of the legal system in America, and a serious rewriting of many laws in America, and sort of overruling many states as well because of the way their political ideologies are formed into them states. But more importantly, how many would have to die before you get those reforms? Because America can be pretty slow when it comes to actually addressing change in politics, and as politics in general can be. So how many people would have to die before you reach an acceptable level of your supposedly justifiable capital punishment?
I would actually, if I were in that position to decide, I would put a moratorium, and in fact, they have a moratorium. That's why they don't execute people in California. And in some areas, I would agree that if we were to abolish capital punishment, the only reason I do it is because it's too costly. And in fact, it was determined that I believe in 2012 they did that if they were to abolish capital punishment, I think they could save about $50 to $100 million a year when it comes to appeals. So if the only reason I would agree to abolishing capital punishment is how costly it is. As for the mentally ill, I would executing them. I would agree is probably unfair. I wouldn't say completely rule them out from being executed, but at the very least take some serious time to review what they. If at the end of the day, if that's going to be a okay thing. As for IQ, I would like to ask, how is that subjective?
Well, an IQ test isn't exactly a perfect measure of a person's capabilities. Like the apparatus you're using to measure them changes depending on who you go to, and thus a person who is otherwise intelligent could get a lower IQ than what they would probably be considered in terms of smartness. Whereas another person who perhaps isn't as adaptable may have a higher IQ than what they have and must be acceptable for the death penalty. Additionally, a person being mentally ill doesn't stop them from having a high IQ. So someone, for instance, with severe disabilities could be really good with numbers and maths and thus be able to complete numeracy and arithmetic really easily and perhaps get a higher score on an IQ test. But again, we come back to what you were saying a second ago. In a capitalist system, to use it again, where economics can give you favorability, is it really possible to reform a system to have no one falling into death row unjustifiably? Because whilst you have people who are able to buy their way out of cases and thus and just as equally impede over people who are potentially innocent but have been screwed over by an unfair legal system, is it justifiable to allow these people the potential to die? And the answer is no, because you can't allow for you can't have a margin of error with the death penalty, because death is something you can't come back from, and thus innocent people can potentially die and have died, as we've seen across the history of America. But again, I think what it comes down to really is it justifiable to execute someone, to impede on someone's right to life? Should that ever be impeded by the state, which supposedly it bans, it considers murder of illegality, but then murdered its own citizens based on the fact that this law was breached? Is that justifiable?
To answer about the if it's justifiable, yes. People who is the logic a bit odd? Sure, but at the end of the day, and yes, it's not a deterrent. And quite frankly, as for the mentally ill, I would probably agree. Yeah, it's unfair to execute them. As for people buying their way out of a death sentence or a life sentence.
No, I mean, like with the appeal cases and even getting into prison in the first place, people, if you have money, you can favour yourself in the legal system based on that fact, based on the fact that money is something that knows no morals and thus can be used to influence cases, as seen with the fact that you're more likely to go on the death row if you're less wealthy. Is it fair to have the death penalty whilst you have that? And when you said the logic is a bit odd, is that not a little bit telling of the nature of the death penalty in itself? That you have to sort of bend logic and ignore reason to justify it in many ways.
Bent logic? I never heard that term before, but when it comes to whether or not it's murder to kill, like if you were to kill me right now, that'd be murder. But if the government does it, it's not. State sanctioned killings is under the law depending on where it is excusable, and the people that have done it are I can't remember the term, but they are free of charges. I cannot remember the term that is used, but they're immune from prosecution for executing an inmate. Another thing you brought up about the methods, you didn't specify what methods, but I would agree that some of them are a bit on the barbaric side. For example, the gas chamber, last used in 1999, it was outlawed on a certain part of the United States. It was declared unconstitutional by I believe the Ninth Circuit for the District of California, and some in other states it's been declared unconstitutional by a state level. That in Nebraska and Georgia, the electric chair has been declared unconstitutional. That was last practiced in 2013 or 15. As for hanging, that was last practiced in 96. I agree those three methods are a bit on the cruel side, where death could be prolonged. Lethal injection I think that's completely a waste of time. And quite frankly, that's why a lot of executions aren't happening, is because of people saying, well, these drugs could cause a lot of pain, and these inmates, because they're going to be unconscious in a matter of minutes, but some have reported that the inmates might be feeling a fiery pain. When it comes to a firing squad, last practiced in 2010, you're shot in the heart, so you're going to die very quickly of a firing squad. And I think that would be a better way to carry out capital punishment if we were to continue. And when you said about the UK and them abolishing capital punishment, I believe last I checked, 52% are in support, or thereabout. 52% are in favor of reinstating the death penalty. But I believe it's illegal in Europe. I think it's been widely where countries in Europe cannot reinstate the death penalty.
Okay, so I'll respond to a lot of things there. You said that the state-sanctioned executions, that is under the law, but that doesn't change the fact that it's murder. It is still essentially taking a life. And yeah, it can be state-sanctioned all you like, but it is still at core murder. It is still a right to life that's been violated, and thus still falls under murder. You said you're mentioning state laws differing, so some states are making certain punishments illegal. It's coming under the barbaric methods used to kill someone. Some states will do that, some states won't. And plenty of prisons, certainly private prisons, are going to do whatever is most cost effective. So why will they care about reforming their punishment to make it more humane, when one method saves them money and one method can be quicker, so they'll just do the cheaper one, and thus they won't care about the state rights. And yeah, you can say reforms, but whilst you have lobbying groups in government and in politics preventing a reform for the sake of their costs, it'll be harder to achieve this, and thus more people are going to be dying in these barbaric methods. You're mentioning firing squads as they hit the heart, but they're still extremely painful, and as are most of these methods. I think it's only really hanging which is the least, like the one's going to cause you the least pain because of the losing consciousness so quickly. But lethal injection, if it goes wrong, can be awful. The gas chamber, yeah, obviously that's barbaric. But only recently that stopped being used. Yeah, obviously the last century, that's not really that long ago. What else is there?
Electric chair.
Oh, the electric chair, that can be terrible. If that goes wrong, then you're going to be in horrendous pain. Like when you have these methods, which they're not humane. We should be really questioning the system that has this and whether this is justifiable to do to a person to not only kill them but to put them through immense pain. And then finally, you're saying you have I don't know whether that came from, but 52% are in favour of the death penalty to be reintroduced. That's a fallacy technically, because that doesn't address the actual argument. That addresses the whether people believe it or not. If a poll came out saying 52% of people agreed with bestiality, like that wouldn't make it right. So.
About the firing squad, yes, it's probably painful, yes, but actually, I'm going to address this point instead first. Why would the state care? It wants cheaper. Well, if they were to practice a certain method that might be cheaper but might offend the Eighth Amendment, they might back off that method, because if they want to carry out that execution, it has to fall within the Eighth Amendment. That's why the gas chamber was found unconstitutional in 1994, and then in 2000, I believe 2002, the states of Nebraska and Georgia found them unconstitutional under violating cruel and unusual punishment under their constitution. As for hanging, yeah, it might cause unconsciousness, but there's been cases where hanging was botched, where a hanging execution was botched. I do agree that, yeah, it would be very horrible to, when it comes to the gas chamber, there's been cases where it was pretty bad how it went. People describing what they saw in the execution, and that might be a bit scarring. When it comes to the electric chair, that's probably even worse, because a lot more pain, and they might lose their bowels, and that's of course disgusting. And that might make the situation worse. As for lethal injection, there was a case where a man it took 2 hours to execute him by lethal injection. Yet in the time since 1977, and then it's only been practiced 3 times, but firing squad, there's been no botched executions. There's only been a few, but that was over 100 years ago, and they didn't even have weapons that had decent accuracy. As for, I'm trying to remember what else you said, that was morally 2% or so were to say bestiality is wrong, if they were to say it was okay. I'm sorry?
I said that you made a fallacy because argumentum ad populum was the exact name. But you said that 50% of people in the UK support capital punishment. That doesn't actually that's not a valid argument, because that doesn't actually say anything about the capital punishment itself. That just says more people agree with it, and hence I said you could argue you could use the same thing and just swap out capital punishment for like bestiality or something and have the same validity.
Yeah, I'll admit that point was flawed. As to I think that was pretty much the points you've made. If there wasn't any I addressed, let me know.
I think so. I mean, I think there's a few you've skipped. You haven't addressed why a murder done by the state is justified. You haven't said why the state has the justification to breach someone else's right. But for someone else, you said, if you take a life, then you deserve to have your rights taken. But that still doesn't change the fact that your rights would have been taken by the state. And regardless of what you do, that right should not be taken, as it is your human right, and human rights shouldn't be breached.
The inmate, by taking, I'll just refer to the person as the condemned. The condemned have pretty much surrendered their right by taking someone else's. They've pretty much shown no regard for anyone else's, and pretty much by taking someone else's life have shown that they pretty much probably do not care. Well, actually, they just don't care, because if they really did care, excuse me, they pretty much don't care. If you're taking another human life, but you know that the consequences might end up your life, then you pretty much just you don't care about your right to live. Yet, when it comes to you probably facing your day to die, then for some reason the inmates start to care. But in the moment where they kill their victim, no, the only rights that matter are their own. They couldn't care less. They only care about their own. They couldn't care less about yours or mine. But when it comes to when it comes to their day to die, then they care. Then they start caring about things, but in the moment, they don't. And
of course, a lot of well, obviously not all case time, but in moments of adrenaline, murders can be easy, and logic goes out the window. However, going back to the idea of they've thrown away their right, does that mean the state should torture this person, or the state should throw away their right to a free trial? Would that be justified?
A free trial?
If so, let's say someone has murdered someone or tortured them, whatever. Should they then lose their right to a free trial and not being tortured and stuff?
If the person just, in the case of murder and a free trial, again, a free trial, I'm assuming like bias-free, not like financially free, right?
Yeah, obviously, like, we still got the problems there, but a free trial, so one without bias, supposedly. But, so should they lose their right to a free trial and the right to not be tortured and stuff?
As for the right to a free trial, yes, it should be bias-free, and where they overturn death sentences, and in fact, entire convictions due to prosecutorial misconduct, or cases where the judge was biased, or the jury may have been biased, and there's also times where the inmate could just simply plead to a lesser sentence of like life without parole, or life with a possibility of parole in like 20, 30 years or so.
But fundamentally, though, you agree they should keep their right to a free trial and the right to not be tortured whilst being detained and stuff, yeah?
Yes, and if the execution is going to take place, it has to, the death place immediately as soon as it's administered. I honestly, as much as sometimes where the case is pretty brutal and some might say, yeah, he deserves the gas chamber, there's been cases where that would take like 14 minutes. And for the witnesses, if there's any, I don't think anyone would, or you'd have to have a strong stomach to see something that is not only probably excruciating for the inmate, but they brought that on themselves, to see someone die over the course of 14 minutes. With a firing squad, and maybe, yeah, hanging, it might be a whole lot faster. And in my opinion, if I had the chance, I would abolish lethal injection, because its legality is, and its effectiveness, I really would call into question. Hanging, I can see probably being a lot less painful. Electrocution, whole lot more painful, and and it probably takes a lot more preparation, and that is more likely to offend the 8th Amendment, along with lethal injection today and the gas chamber. The only methods I can see that would not offend the 8th Amendment is hanging and firing squad.
So, bringing us back to what I was trying to say, so if the state shouldn't abolish torture, if the state shouldn't breach torture rights and breach the right not to have a non-fair trial, why should the state then breach the right to life? Why should some rights be more important than others? The state has to, if the state can breach their right to life, who's to say they can't then breach other rights, and other human rights can just flaunt whenever they decide?
If you're going to, the reason I say that is, if you're going to execute them, at the very least, get out and at least get it over as quickly as possible. Because torturing them might be just a tad on the sadistic side. As for the other human rights, we have checks and balances, so if people were to try to do something that's, of course, questionable, we have courts that stop it. Like, for example, when you take my commander-in-chief with that whole travel ban, twice it got blocked by a federal judge or something. And the first one was, I will have to admit, was hilarious to see that get blocked, and then try again and get blocked again was also hilarious to see how it failed twice. So when it comes to, that they just go and breach other human rights, I wouldn't say it's probably, yeah, it's against the law to cruel and unusual punishment. I find nothing unusual about capital punishment. I don't find it cruel, depending on how you do it. If you do it where it takes like 2 hours, like in Arizona, to execute the inmate, yeah, that's cruel. If it takes a few minutes or if it's done by hanging, it might take a few minutes. If it's firing squad, it might take less than a few seconds, or about a minute. Then I wouldn't say that's cruel.
But again, even ignoring all the stuff with the courts, and even if all that was fine, which I'm not saying it is because it clearly isn't, but even if all that was fine, why should the state take this human rights away when it still has to uphold others? What's to stop the state from then saying if it can take away your right to a human life because on the basis of you taking someone else's right to life, why should it not then act in other ways? So it could say, oh, well, you were not fair to this person, therefore we will take away these rights. You tortured this person, so we could torture this, so we should take away your right not to be tortured. How many rights can you flaunt based on this idea that, oh, well, this person did this, so we can do them? Where do you draw the line of morality? I think as a consequence of that, we should have to draw a line and firmly say, no, the right to human life should never be breached by the state because it's never justifiable to murder. So even when this person has committed a crime like murder, we should not then murder them. Otherwise, we can then justify, we can then supposedly do all these terrible things to them, which can easily see as wrong. And that we can agree that that's not his right to do. Therefore, we should not murder the state, members of the state.
And again, members of the state that have done these horrible things, and besides, there's been cases where, and I have to ask if for those inmates, if they know that they could die, wouldn't they just plead down to a lesser sentence so they wouldn't have to go through that consequence? And again, we have checks and balances that would stop the government if they were to flaunt these other rights and say that we'll hold those up, but then not uphold these others. We can have certain things if it gets out of control.
Well, checks and balances are only so good for a certain point. They don't always work. And again, the government can't always be held accountable. It's only 50 years ago that the state of LGBT rights and black rights and civil rights in general weren't great. The state was legal to discriminate based on race and gender and sexuality not that long ago. So just saying, oh, you've got checks and balances for the state as a justification for having the death penalty and supposedly letting it work is really dubious. But again, I'll ask you, should human rights, if we abolish the right to life if you commit a crime, does that then make it justifiable to torture your inmates and deny them rights to a fair trial? And if the answer to that is no, if you think, oh, these rights should not be breached, they should always be fair trials, and of not torturing your inmates, then that should tell you there's a hypocrisy in then saying, oh, we'll take away your right to life if you breach it. And it comes down to the core concept that an individual should not have their right to life taken by the state, regardless of what they've done. And maybe another person have taken away someone else's right to life, and that is no one's saying that's a good thing, and that's definitely something that's punishable by imprisonment even. But at the same time, they as a human being should not have their right to life taken from them, and thus the death penalty should not be enacted and be able to be legal by the state, because then the state will be committing a human rights offence against its own citizens, and thus should not be able to do that, and thus that's why capital punishment should not be legal.
When it comes to the human rights, I'd have to ask: is it not hypocritical for the inmate to say that their life matters when they didn't show the same thing to the inmate didn't show the same to their victim? And keeping them alive isn't going to do anything. Some people might, be terrified of prison. Some might enjoy it. And getting them out of society once and for all would be, I would say at the very least, just making sure that, and we don't have to have that on our minds ever again. As for the human rights, executing your inmate, depending on how you do it, isn't torture. I do agree that the methods at least 3 of the 5 methods are flawed, but that's just the methods. If we just focus on those 2 and we were to just go with that, it wouldn't be torture. And quite frankly, your right to life is, in my opinion, is only if you don't kill people. Unless it's self-defense, then it's still valid. But which actually made me think about it. Is your right to life violated when someone kills you in self-defense? I bet I'm going to assume that's probably not. but I'm just curious.
Well, self-defense is another interesting area of subjectivity and context, isn't it? Because depending on where you stand, certainly in the case of, you can look at any real racially aggravated murder by a policeman, where people don't know where to draw the line on where self-defense and murder is. So that would be a bit of a dangerous sort to introduce there. But coming back to things you said, yeah, sure, it's hypocritical for a person to say, "Oh, my life matters," when they murder someone, but then that doesn't justify the hypocrisy of the state and the breaching of another person's rights by the state to murder someone. Like, regardless of what the person who murdered someone is saying, the state can't then just murder someone on the basis that, oh, well, you are a hypocrite and therefore you'll be murdered. And again, you mentioned that, oh, they didn't do anything if they're on death row, but again, that doesn't justify losing their right to life. They may well be in prison, but their human rights aren't being breached, and they would be breached if a person were to murder them. And as for torture, yeah, it's all very well saying, oh, we don't have it during execution, but firstly, again, if they've lost their right to life because of this, then who's to say the state can't then say, oh, we have the right to torture this person because they lost their right to life and they lost their right to these human rights as a consequence. But secondly, it's not limited to just the execution. What about just police officers roughing up inmates? What about literally being tortured in the interrogation processes and the court cases? Where do you stop when you start just tossing away human rights on the basis that, oh, well, they breached someone else's rights, they will lose theirs? How do you hold a state accountable when you allow them to breach someone else's human rights, regardless of what they've done?
Hang on a second. I'm checking the chat. Cameron I'm not going to even bother with the last name. Did she?
I'd imagine so.
Okay, just checking that. As for the police brutality, well, I'm just going to call it the guards beating on the inmates or mistreating them. Again, the inmates can sue. And of course, doesn't mean they're going to win. I mean, just the chance doesn't mean the results are going to be in their favor, and that's how it's probably always going to be. And police brutality, you can sue, and people have sued. And when it comes to self-defense and with murder, I'm going to just take an example. Did you hear of the case? Do you remember hearing in 2000 when Black Lives Matter was really getting momentum when the Ferguson shooting, a police officer shot a 18-year-old black man. I personally believe it was justified because he was charging at the officer, and in cases where it's obviously self-defense, where there's evidence to show that the person's charging at them left marks and injuries and have caused these things, I would say it would be justified if you can prove that there's marks, at the very least there's marks on you.
Hello? Hello? I think Ethan will be back in a second. Wait for him to get back. Talk about dead air. On a side note, to anyone who's watching this live, I was meant to be having a debate with other people, with the white YouTuber, but sadly he was busy. That's going to be tomorrow, but never mind. If you do want to debate me, hit me up because I do love a good debate. Literally any topic. It can be anything you want. It's like a mini plug whilst S-Man is away. Literally though, any topic. And I'll debate you on it because debates are fun and I like talking. It'd been good if it was original though.
I'm sorry?
S-Man, what happened? You cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just had to. Neighbor, I don't know why, but was asking for something, and that startled me. I had to go ask. I had to help the neighbor real quick. Okay, so what were you saying?
You were talking about self-defense, I believe.
Oh, right, and how if you can prove that there's marks on you, and you can prove, well, in the case of Michael Brown, there was evidence he committed a strong arm robbery, and there was evidence, and I believe there were witnesses, I think, where he charged with the officer, and the officer acted in example like that. If you can prove that you have injuries on you, and you can prove, and quite frankly, like, you can show evidence that you were attacked, and you can show that you can show evidence that you were attacked and show what's happened, then yeah, I call it self-defense. But if there's no evidence to back it up, then you could probably make a case for murder, but you would of course have to provide evidence for a grand jury if you were to make a claim of self-defense. They'd probably go to a grand jury.
Well, I mean, I'm not too sure of the case of Mr. Brown, or Michael Brown in Filton, but I won't go into it. But when I say police brutality, you say, oh, the inmates can sue, but suing is not just like, oh, snap my fingers, you're in court, fair trial. Like, it's complex progress. Like you just said, you laugh then, like, we both know it's not as easy as just like appearing in court with your like ace attorney lawyers just all in line. Like, it's not as simple as that. And again, what I was trying to say is that when you breach one human right, what is to stop the state from breaching others? You allow them to breach over one, then who's to say the state can't then justify other breaching of human rights? How do the inmates even have the ability to sue when you just denied them one human right, and the state can easily deny them another by saying, oh, well, you don't have the right to a trial anymore. You don't have the right to protest your brutal treatment and torture by the state. Put on to self-defense. Like, again, that's another subjective, contentious issue. Like, to base a capital punishment and justified death on this, in the case of people like Michael Brown and others, is atrocious. Especially when, if the police officer is guilty, then he's murdered someone. So then should he not be punished to death? Like, but by these own laws, you tread the line between justified death and keeping people alive very thinly, and thus lots of people are potentially in danger of being killed under this system. And again, a direct question: does the state have the justification to breach someone else's rights? Because you keep saying, oh, if someone else takes their right, then someone else kills someone, then that should lose them their right. But then that doesn't mean that the state has justification to then execute their citizens. That doesn't change that.
The justification to execute a person because they've taken someone else's right, I would say it's justified, because who is that inmate then to complain that my human right to live? Who are they to argue that when they've taken someone else's? Who are they to even say, well, my life should be considered just as much as that person's? And quite frankly, and sure, yeah, you could sue, like like how you described it. Yeah, sure, it's complex and it costs money. But again, there are lawyers that pro bono lawyers, and again, when it comes to legal when it comes to inmates on capital punishment, people they're setting a higher standard of what lawyers must be to be considered adequate representation. And just another thing, I haven't really heard you say anything on this, but if we were to abolish capital punishment, should it be retroactive?
So the past sins of past capital punishment should be forgiven. So sorry. So when you say retroactive, what do you mean? Like.
Okay, so I'm going to use a few examples. When the state of Connecticut abolished their death penalty, it was not retroactive, which meant that the inmates that were sentenced to death before a certain date where the death penalty would be effectively outlawed.
Oh, yeah, okay, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
So to answer that directly, I believe so, because in the same way that when homosexuality was decriminalised, the government has been giving pardons to those who are criminalised under it, in the UK at least. That should be the same too. But to come on to a few things you said, directly, two wrongs don't make a right. Like you don't, someone's human rights should never be violated simply because they violated someone else's human rights. Like, I think we can lay this out in a set of statements. I guess statement one would be: should a person's human rights ever be violated?
Their human right is not as valuable, or is not as because
No, just directly though. Should a person's human right be violated, regardless of context? Should that human right be violated?
In that instance, yes.
No, but that's that's the point. Without the instance, with no context, should a person's human right be violated?
Out of context, no. In context,
context doesn't matter though. Why should if you're going to say yes, why should someone's human right be violated? Why should the state have a power to violate someone's human right?
Because they pretty much surrendered it. When they killed someone, they pretty much showed no caring of their own human right. They pretty much damn well knew, pardon my French there, but they knew very well that the consequences for their actions, the consequences could, be fatal on their end. But of course, they won't care then. But for some odd reason, as soon as they're on death row, then they start to care. Then they start to feel sorry and show that the crocodile tears of remorse. And quite frankly, we don't need people like that in society who've done some of these horrible, abhorrent things. And again, I could bring up a number of cases where it was just horrible, but that wouldn't make any difference to you. No, I'm not trying to be disrespectful there, but at the end of the day, we don't need people like that alive in society. They serve no purpose just sitting in a cell every day for the rest of their life. And if we were to just execute them, we could just get them off. We could just get them out of this empty and start unclogging the backlog of appeals. And if we were to abolish capital punishment and not make it retroactive, we could just prevent the further onslaught of death sentences and just focus those 2,000 people on death row today. And all right, this person is mentally handicapped or mentally ill, therefore they should not be executed, because if you're mentally ill, you didn't know what you were doing, or if you're mentally handicapped, you don't even understand what's going on. And the only critique I would have of capital punishment, like how I mentioned in our last debate, which got us onto this topic, was how it's unfairly applied to like men. And that would be my criticism, is how 16 women versus 1,400 men over the last 40 years have been executed.
Well,
I
mean, ignoring, I don't think that for the purposes of this debate just yet, gender even comes into the validity of capital punishment. Like that's obviously there are problems with the system in that regard, but that's a separate issue to whether capital punishment is justifiable. Coming back, you were saying, if this person didn't care that they were breaching someone else's right, they didn't care how fatal their actions could be. And yeah, people can commit murder. Either they don't care or they do care, and they're like psychopaths and they're terrible people. But that doesn't mean the state then has the right to take away their right. That the hypocrisy of a state doing this and the illegitimacy is paramount to why I'm saying this. And yeah, again, if you allow them to breach this right, then this isn't it's essentially a step towards other rights being breached, because they could just as easily then turn around and say, oh, we can breach this right because they did this, so therefore we can breach their right to not be tortured. We can say, oh, well, you don't have the right to have a trial, and justify it by saying, oh, well, you let us get rid of this right. Core to what I'm saying here, why is it it's not hypocritical. It's not what I'm saying. The state doesn't have the right to take away someone's human right, and you haven't said why they do, because you've said each time, oh, this person's done something awful, so they've lost their right, and yeah, they were hypocritical. Fine,
they surrendered it.
Yeah, but why does that give the state the right to execute this person, the state specifically?
Oh, okay. A reason I would justify the state doing it is because that person essentially actually just surrendered their right to live, and they pretty much.
Why does the state have the right? The person, yeah, they're hypocritical, fine. Why does that give the state the right? Why does that allow the state to breach someone's human right? Specifically, the state.
The state, the reason I would say that is because, quite frankly, like that inmate might actually find a bit more safety having the state do it than just in prison, because if they're in prison, they might end up getting killed by other people. So at the very least, the state will be doing a cleaner job. As to why the state should do it is because, again, we don't need people like that alive. And another thing when you said about where would the line be, I draw it at the right to live. As for, if you've done it, if you've done something like that, then I would say, you don't deserve to live because you've shown something like that. And you said it's hypocritical, fine. But another thing I haven't heard you address is, okay, then who is that inmate to complain about their right to live when, again, else? But then for some weird reason, immediately as soon as a guilty verdict is given and a sentence of death is imposed, then they care. Or when the death penalty is a possibility, but then they get a life sentence, then they care. Then they show remorse. Then they feel sorry that they did something they didn't have to do. And again, why should we have people like that alive in society? What purpose do people who've committed such awful things, what is the point of having them alive? If it's something where killed, like for example, drug offenses, and that's something I forgot to point out in the debate. Drug offenses, for certain drugs, I can understand it being a bit harsh, but as for drugs that are really dangerous and could kill people very easily, like the drug pink, for example, people like that deserve a harsh sentence. And I do believe it's illegal to execute people for drug-related offenses. I think it might be legal if it's a crime against the state, but I think for the most part, under Kennedy versus Louisiana, I believe it's illegal to do so.
Well, your first point there about why do we need these people alive? Does that even matter? Does the person have to justify themselves to the state if they have their right to life? They don't have to. They even have to do anything for the state. They should have their guaranteed right to life. They don't have to give their word, because you could, using this argument, I could say that, why do we need these the business class? Why do we need the bourgeoisie? Anyone can tell you who they don't think is worthy of being in society. Hence why we have non-subjective, objective, concrete human rights which don't get breached. You're saying, I would draw the line, coming on to the second thing you said, about, or I would draw the line past right to live, that's the only right we take away. But then people in the state could just as easily say, we've breached this human right, this right is expendable. We've taken away this right because they've done this. Therefore, we will take away these other rights because clearly they didn't care that they were losing their rights when they were committing a murder. And all of a sudden, you have these terrible prisons where torture is going on, where you've lost the right to a fair trial, and where rights can be because of what you said. Hence why human rights are the paramount structure to what we have. And the right to life should never be breached. And you still haven't given direct reasoning for why the state has the right to take away a life. Because every single reason you've given has always related to, this person will be satisfied, or this person did something bad, therefore they should be punished for it. It's never about the state and their own right, the state's right to take away a person's human right. And it comes down to the illegitimacy of removing a human right by the state. And that is paramount to what I'm saying. The state has no legitimacy to take away someone else's right, and thus their right to life should not be breached.
Okay. I pointed out that there is no point, and yes, it does matter. Again, there is no purpose of them being alive in society. They've done such horrible things that they're going for the rest of their lives. They're a waste of space, they're a waste of money, they're a waste of time. So what is the point of keeping them here? They're just going to sit in a cell all day. They're alive and breathing. Their victim obviously isn't. And I think it's only fair to subject them to put them in the same place where they put their victim. And yeah, sure, I've pointed out a few times that it might make someone else happy, but in some cases, no one was happy. And again, let me ask this. There's some crimes against the state where I guess the state might be considered, in quotation marks, the victim, like espionage. Would the state be justified in executing someone in the crime for like the crime of espionage or aircraft hijacking or things like that, where pretty much where almost no one really commits those type of crimes? I'd like to ask, would execution for crimes against the state be justified?
Well, to answer that, no, because it's again, the state doesn't have the legitimacy to override their human rights to do that, as I've already said. And yeah, it's a crime, but it's still a breaching of their human right to end their right to life. Thus, no. To go back to what you were saying there, the purpose someone holds in society is entirely subjective. So I don't think to say, oh, well, they hold no purpose, they're a waste of time, just kill them, is a justifiable thing. And you're saying, oh, waste of money, but it costs more to put them on death row in the first place. So you'd be wasting more money by putting them onto death row and thus enacting capital punishment than just imprisoning them. You're saying, oh, you said waste of space, waste of time, waste of money. What about to the family of this person who are innocent? They're not any of those things, because they are a terrible person, but they are still a family member. It's like I know I'm invoking a family thing here, but if a member of your family was to be put into prison, they would still be part of your family. Now,
of course.
They would still, no matter how heinous their crime would be, you would still see them as a family member. And yeah, you might not like what they've done at all, and you'd be disgusted by them, but you would still be family. And they wouldn't be a waste of whatever to you. Thus, saying, they're a waste of time and space and purpose, and we should just kill them, prove a state, is entirely subjective, and that's not a good basis for making a law. And again, I'll keep coming back to this, because you still haven't really addressed it. How is the state legitimized in murdering and breaching people's human rights through capital punishment? Because every single answer has been a case of the individual did something wrong, so we must kill them. It's not a case of the state having the right to breach human rights. You end up falling into dangerous territory by doing that. And just quickly, I'm going to let you go on, but we're probably going to look at wrapping this up soon.
All right. When it comes to if it was my family member, if they've committed a horrible crime, sure, I might love them, but at the same time, I cannot really feel all that bad for them, because after all, you killed someone, so I can't feel all that bad for you. Of course, it's like it would be nice if they weren't, but if that's how it's going to be, that's how it's going to be. And didn't you criticize me earlier for saying that I let my emotions play into deciding if I'm for capital punishment? So wouldn't it be bad if I were to let my emotions say that, oh, because it's my family member, that, oh, no, they can't be executed? Isn't that a bit odd?
Of course, an emotional argument, or like an argument that relies on emotion isn't, or an argument that is solely consistent of emotion is a poor one, but it's more of a, so I'm raising the point that you're saying that, they're a waste of space and a waste of time, and people will be happy with them gone, or they won't care. But clearly that isn't the case, because if it was, because just using your own example, you would still feel something if your family member was killed. So clearly that person wasn't a waste of time to you. So for anyone, there are always going to be negatively affected families, or for whom the waste of space thing wouldn't apply. And even more so, there are going to be people who will never even know these people existed, so they wouldn't even have been aware they existed in society, so their purpose didn't even matter to them. Anyway, continue. I interrupted you, so go ahead.
No, you're fine. Another thing, sure, I might not like it, but if that's how it's gonna, if the state's gonna do it, well, that's their call, not mine. And quite frankly, yes, they are a waste of space, because they're not contributing a damn thing to society. Like other inmates, sure, they're not contributing, but again, we do have checks and balances. So if the state were to say, you know what, Owen, your government were to say, you know what, we just took someone else's, in quotation marks, right to live, I think that ends the minute you commit murder, or at least the seriousness to argue for it. if they're to say, for example, you don't deserve to have whatever right because this, like for example, let's say you didn't have the right to be paid the same amount as everyone at your work. Obviously, that's illegal, and if people were to try to do that, there's other parts of the government would intervene to stop that. As for executing people, a waste of time and money. Again, I would not be completely opposed to abolishing the death penalty, only because of the financial factors. But the only way I'd even be on board of getting rid of capital punishment is on the grounds that it's not retroactive. If you were sentenced to death before a certain date, then you're still going to be on death row. If you committed the crime after, you're fine. As for why should the state have it? Why should the state even breach that human right? Again, that human right, quite frankly, was surrendered. Again, those people didn't give a damn about their victim, but again, for some very strange reason, for some odd reason, they're gonna care after those consequences. And again, why should we have these awful people who've committed such horrendous, heinous crimes in this society? And quite frankly, sure, yeah, some people might not like it, but quite frankly, it doesn't have to care whether or not you like the fact someone was executed for a crime they've committed. The government doesn't have to care. And yeah, I don't think the government should have to care about how you feel about a certain thing. That, like, if your relative is being executed, well, the problem is with your relative, and it's your relative's fault for putting you through. So if that relative is now going to die because of an obviously poor decision they made, that's on them. The state, I wouldn't hold liable for hurting people's feelings when it comes to executions. It's more the relative's fault that they've put everyone through these emotions. That's their fault, not the state's.
Well, of course, it is the person's fault for committing the crime, but that still doesn't legitimize the state in executing them. I don't think it's a case of feelings are feelings shouldn't come into the law. I was merely pointing out that to argue that people would be happier or wouldn't benefiting from having quote unquote purposeless people executed from society isn't true, because people would care in some regards. People who knew them would care, family and stuff. And again, economically, it doesn't make sense. You're saying, oh well, pay discrimination is different, and the right not to be discriminated against is different. But again, you allowed the state you allowed the state from the right to remove one person's right, and regardless of what the person who your right was removed from did, that still shows that you are able to remove someone's right in certain circumstances, and depending on who's in charge, those circumstances will change. Not everyone has the same morals and values, so if you remove the idea that a human right should never be breached by the state or anyone, you allow for holes to be poked in these things, and thus the decay of other human rights based on this. And I suppose, as we are sort of wrapping up now, I will let you have the final word, because I've already given my points. I'm sort of saying the same sort of like, oh, the state has no legitimacy, which I still don't think you've really addressed, but I guess I'll let you have the final word. As you are.
All right. Thank you. When it comes to who's in charge, again, checks and balances. Again, if let's say for a moment Donald Trump was to say, you know what, I think we should just deport all Muslims, we have to deport all Mexicans or all Muslims, for example. If it was something like that, or people's morals would change. In some areas, again, checks and balances, and federal courts could stop it, or state courts, depending on if we're talking, like you said, who's in charge, maybe the governor or the state. As for the legitimacy, and actually, there's something else I needed to point out. Pointless people, inmates are pointless people. They are pointless. If you're going to be spending the rest of your life behind bars, or if you got a sentence that makes it look like a life sentence regardless, pretty much have no purpose to live. You have no purpose in society. You're not going to contribute anything except just like twiddle your thumbs in a prison cell till you die. And at that point, yeah, your life doesn't matter because you're not going to contribute anything. You're just going to be twiddling your thumbs. All because you made some very poor choices that you did not, because of, again, odd thinking because of odd thinking that said, for some reason in your head, thinking, you know what, I'm going to kill that person, therefore, and then at trial and conviction, when you're sentenced to death, then for some reason these people show sorrow and crocodile tears, and it wouldn't surprise me if a large chunk of them have no remorse and could not care less about the people they killed.
Well, interesting point. I mean, I still think you didn't address state legitimacy, but that's to be left for another day. Thank you very much for joining me, S-Man, and thanks to anyone and everyone who watched. And join me next time for whenever I next have a debate. And go and watch S-Man's channel too, because interesting stuff in there as well.
And another...
Bye.